Good afternoon, everyone. I'm sure many of you have been on our webinars before, but for those of you who are new, today's presentation is going to run for about 45 minutes, and then we will open for your questions. Throughout the webinar, please use the chat box on your GoToWebinar dashboard to send us your questions. And then when we get to the QA portion, I'll send you a message asking if you still want to ask your question or if it was answered already. And if you do still want to ask, I'll unmute you so you can ask it. Be sure to unmute yourself as well, because I can't unmute you if you have muted yourself. If you have other questions during the event, during the webinar, you can use the chat box too for that. This is Megan Jones, welcoming from ICO, welcoming you to today's webinar, one of the many presentations that were scheduled for our workshop in San Antonio, but will instead be presented as a webinar. This and all of the distance learning series webinars this summer will count as an hour of training towards your CCEA certification. So keep your confirmations on your in your records for when your certification renewal is due. With us today is ICEA's previous Vice President of Professional Development, a many-time winner of ICEA Best Overall Paper, and fantastic gentleman as well, Andy Prince from NASA, giving Are You Smarter Than an Algorithm? Take it away, Andy.
All right, thank you, Megan. Appreciate everyone joining. Good afternoon to everyone on the East Coast, and good morning to everybody else. So the motivation for this study that I did and documented in the paper came actually after I had written a previous paper presented a few years ago called The Dangers of Parametrics. And in that paper, I talked about the problems that introducing subjective variables into regression analysis caused. Okay, what the problems it caused when we introduce those subjective variables into our parametric models. After I presented that paper, I got pushback from some people in the space cost community about that, and particular, my old boss Joe Hamaker gave me a hard time about it, and hopefully Joe, hope you're listening in today. And so you know, though I continue to believe and continue to believe that it's a dangerous thing to use subjective parameters, I wanted to see if there was a way I could prove. Could I prove definitively whether or not using subjective parameters was a bad thing or not? And so what I decided to do, and I'm going to go into the, okay, come on, there we go. So what I'm going to, what this talk is about is my attempt to conduct a survey, gather data from across the cost community, and use that data to evaluate whether or not subjective inputs from cost professionals can do better than a model that contains only objective parameters. And so I'm going to go through a little introduction, talk about the approach to this analysis and some lessons learned there, talk about the results. We'll explore just briefly if monkeys can do just as well, and then we'll discuss what we learned from all of this. So I mentioned before this paper I wrote a few years ago, back in 2016, where I stated, and much like the dark side of the force from Star Wars methodology, subjective parameters seduce the cost model developer. And so this seduction is caused by the fact we're trying to explain this random noise in our data, and it makes our model statistics better, and it enables us to fine-tune the estimates. Okay, well, as I mentioned before, several people in the field of space systems cost analysis let me know that they strongly disagreed with this. Don McKenzie, for example, a former, or not current, he was a past Fryman winner, I shouldn't say former, past Fryman Award winner, you know, said this to me in an email. He says, I can offer this. Having been a longtime Price H user, I believe that employing subjective cost drivers is superior to models with only measurable inputs. Okay. So obviously a significant disagreement here. Well, here's what the scientists have to say about this, okay? And I've quoted many of these people in papers I've written in the past, but the gist of their argument is that, hey, we as humans are primed to make judgments on what we know and what we perceive, okay? In other words, what's immediately in front of us. And this judgment works very fast, okay? So like our ancestors would not have had time when they heard a rustling as they were walking through the jungle and they heard a rustling in the bushes to do a multivariate cost analysis and, you know, see if it was a right thing to run or go investigate or whatever. No, they had to decide very quickly, could that be a tiger in that bush or something else, and take appropriate action. So, but unfortunately, our judgment is very much subject to biases, and I've talked about these biases at, you know, some length in previous papers, such as the psychology of cost estimating. So I'm not going to revisit that here. But this biased judgment introduces more error. Okay, it introduces additional error into any assessment process, and numerous studies and trials have shown that simple algorithms are just plain superior to human judgment. However, the cost estimators, and I list several here who have let me know that they don't agree with this assessment, you know, have a different argument. Okay, first of all, each spaceflight system is unique, and that's true. I don't disagree with that. Okay, they all have their challenges and peculiarities. No parametric model, no matter how good it is, can account for all these unique system attributes. Okay, and that is certainly true too, as I've found in the many years I've spent in the business. Our data limited and imperfect. That is, I agree with that too. Okay, so I don't disagree with anything they're saying so far. And that they also state cost estimating is highly subjective to begin with. So just go ahead and be upfront about it. Well, there's some truth there too. Okay, I don't necessarily disagree with that. And subjective variables allow the estimator to address issues that may be important to the customer. Well, yeah, that does give you that flexibility, but does it also introduce additional error? And finally, they, you know, claim you cannot replace in-depth knowledge and years of experience with an algorithm. Well, I don't know. The algorithms are getting pretty good out there. Some artificial intelligence stuff starting to kind of scare me. So I'm glad I'm more towards the end of my career than the beginning. Let me just say it that way. So here's the problem statement. Would a cost model consisting solely of objective parameters do better than a cost model with both objective and subjective parameters? So I need to design an experiment, okay? And that's why as I mentioned earlier, I wanted to do an experiment that would test whether or not people, you know, cost estimators could do better estimating the cost if they had subjective parameters to work with than if they only had objective, okay? And so this is sort of the human versus machine challenge, shall we say? Okay. So here's how I designed the experiment. First of all, needed to define or develop two space system cost models. One model would have both subjective and objective inputs, and then the second model would have only objective inputs. That way I could do side-by-side comparisons. I wanted to use completed, meaning developed, built, and launched space systems to test both these models, okay? I didn't want these missions to be in the model development set, okay? I wanted this to be a model built on earlier missions and use these later missions, or at least different mission set, to do the testing. And I relied on something called Cadre data, okay, which is just a NASA standard data collection template and process as an unbiased source for the information for these for this test data set. Then this next step was to solicit inputs for these subjective parameters from space cost professionals. I didn't provide them the model, but I did tell them what model it did come from. And then I was going to do an evaluation, okay, get the subjective inputs from the cost professionals, take the objective inputs from Cadre, and evaluate the performance of both models. And of course, in doing that, generate lots of statistics, as I'll talk about, and then hopefully pick a winner. Okay, be able to clearly say, yay, this, you know, either subjective parameters do add value, or or subjective parameters don't add value. So first step, how to find the right model. Okay, well, it needs to estimate spaceflight hardware. It needs to have some subjective inputs. Okay, you know, not too recent, but not too old, and not too complex, but not too simple. Okay, so I kind of ruled out using, say, something like a, you know, a commercial model which has lots of inputs, very complex. But it also ruled out using just, say, a simple weight-based CER, for example. I wanted something that was a little more robust than that. Well, I was able to find that in a model developed by Joe Hamaker for NASA back in 2011 called Quick Cost. It's Quick Cost version 5.0. It estimates the cost of a robotic spacecraft bus plus the science instruments, okay? And it's based on NASA missions. It's a single CER, as I'll show you in the next slide, has based on 131 data points. So it's a pretty robust model, and has 8 input parameters, including 3 subjective inputs. So there you go. Now I've got a model that I can use to solicit subjective input data and test. This is Quick Cost 5.0. I'm not going to go through this in detail, other than to point out that what you see in red is the 3 subjective inputs: instrument complexity, bus new design, and instrument new design. And you can see the parameters there. This was a log transform regression, and I have the file. Joe had provided the file to those of us at in NASA with all the data. So I had all the data for this model as well as the actual model itself. With that data, I was able to develop an objective model. So I took the same data set, the same 131 data points, and I did a regression analysis, a log transform ordinary least squares regression, using the same objective parameters that are in Quick Cost. So Quick Cost had 5 objective parameters: dry mass, power, authority to proceed, that's ATP, lifetime of the space system, and its destination, whether it was Earth orbiting or beyond Earth orbiting. So I created that model, and that was another nice thing, is now, you know, the only difference between the models is one has subjective inputs and the other one is objective parameters only. I did realize after I'd gotten well into this process that I had made one little change when I created the objective model. I had somehow or another missed the fact that when Joe did his regression, he did not use the log of authority to proceed date. He used the actual authority to proceed date. So I used log of ATP. I don't think it really made much difference, to be honest. I think for the purpose of this analysis, it was close enough. So here's a comparison of the model statistics. And if you look down under the column under Quick Cost 5.0 and compare that to the objective model, which has no subjective input parameters, you can see, hey, the objective model did a lot better. Okay, and a lot better R squared, standard error was lower, the mean of the residuals was lower, so on. I mean, you just go right down the list here. And so, hey, does that mean the model's better? Well, keep in mind, these kind of statistics are based on how the model performs relative to the data that it's built on. Okay, it doesn't really tell you how well the model may perform doing forward estimating. We assume that the better the statistics, the better it will do for forward estimating, but it really doesn't prove that. Okay, so and something else to keep in mind, you know, Quick Cost has got 3 additional parameters that aren't in the objective model. That's going to increase the R squared, and obviously, and when Joe went through and did his analysis and assigned the values for these subjective parameters, it would have had an impact on improving the statistics. And if you want some more information on that, you can go back and look at the paper I wrote, Dangers of Parametrics, to understand how that works. Okay, here's the test data set. I found 15 NASA science missions that had launched since 2011. Okay, and I thought, wow, this is really great, a nice, rich, deep data set. It's everything from missions, Earth orbiting missions, astrophysics missions, Earth observing missions. It's got missions to Mars and to a mission that's going to an asteroid. And I thought, hey, this and a mission that went to Jupiter. So I thought, wow, this is great. It's just got we got everything here. Okay, we got everything. And so I thought, wonderful. I'll use all 15. Hold that thought in your head, by the way. This is a survey instrument I created. And there was actually another page to the survey, which was just instructions. It was in the appendix to the paper. You can read that. But you can see here, I just list the missions, you know, and then across the top, I'm asking for inputs for the new design, instrument complexity. On the right, I define, give the definitions for those, and those definitions are straight from the documentation for quick cost, okay? And that is the full and complete definition. So I provided that to all of the survey participants. And so their job was to fill out these inputs, you know, for all 15 missions. So it was a total of 45 inputs for the bus new design, instrument complexity for all 15 missions. And all they had to do was provide these values, and then I would take that and plug that into the quick cost model along with the objective parameters I'd gotten from Cadre. I did ask a few demographic questions. I didn't want to get too nosy here, but I thought it would be good to know a little bit about people taking the survey. So these were pretty basic, just trying to get a feel for, you know, whether a person worked for government or industry or for a support contractor, and how many years they've been in the business, and a little bit about them personally. So, so you'll see that what the results were from that here in just a few minutes. And then distribution, okay? So I sent this survey out to about 50 people, 50 professionals in the U.S., in NASA, U.S. government and business, international cost communities. I sat back and I waited for responses, okay? And I waited, and I waited, and I waited. And by the way, I sent out a little deadline asking for, you know, responses back by a certain date. When that deadline was approaching and I'd only gotten 2 or 3 responses, I sent out some reminders that, oh, by the way, you know, I'm still waiting, please respond to this. And I waited, and I waited, and I waited some more. I extended the deadline and continued to contact people, but responses were very slow to come in. Well, what happened? Okay. Why was the, and you'll see here in a minute how many responses I did get. Why were people not responding to what I thought was a wonderful opportunity to contribute to increasing the knowledge of our cost community? Well, I figured out the survey was too long. Asking people to provide 45 inputs was just too much. I probably would have gotten a better response had I selected 5 of those 15 missions and just sent that out, okay? A number of people responded to me and said, hey, Andy, I just don't feel qualified. I don't, especially this was true of people who did not work in the NASA space community. You know, people from Department of Defense and some people I know from other countries said, hey, I don't know anything about these missions. Now, if it had been me, I'd done at least a little internet research, but, you know, I can understand that probably people didn't have time, okay? That was the other problem. This kind of ties into the fact it was a long survey. People didn't know a lot about these missions. At least some of the people didn't know much about these missions. Even people who worked at NASA didn't know a lot about some of the missions. This was going to, they didn't want to just sit there and say, oh, I'm going to guess this is a such and such, you know, 25% or 75%. No, they want to do a good job. They want to do a good job, and it was a long survey, and they saw it was going to be very time consuming. They just didn't have time. I mean, we're busy people, right? Money, if you're a contractor, especially a support contractor, what you have to count for all your time, right? And you know, I mean, I know a lot of people in the cost community and have a lot of friends in the cost community, but they probably don't like me well enough to give up nights and weekends, okay, to fill out a survey for me. And I can get that, okay, I understand. You know, love only goes so far. Lack of interest, yeah, probably some people looked at this and went, you know, that's okay, and that's okay. I did ultimately get 10 full responses and 1 partial response, and even to get that, I had to kind of browbeat my staff and the contractors who work with me to get the responses. Okay, so it didn't go as well. This part of the process did not work as well as I had hoped. But who are these people who I did finally get to respond? Well, you can see most of them work for a government services contractor. I did get 1, this was the partial response, from a hardware prime contractor. 3 worked for NASA. You can see the age distribution, it's actually wasn't too bad. It's kind of spread across all age groups, and also as far as number of years in the space business. Maybe that was a little heavily weighted towards the higher end, but really we had not, once again, I think a nice distribution there, as we did years as a cost estimator. So even the number of respondents were small, I thought in general it was pretty good distribution in most areas. Now gender was not, it was heavily male, but that probably does kind of reflect our industry, and everybody who did participate was a US citizen. Okay, so at least I had some data. Okay, so I'm not going to let the low response rate deter me. I've got data, I'm going to analyze it, and I'm going to see what this tells us. Okay, so it's got easy to generate statistics, right? You know, I can plug all the numbers into the models, generate estimates. Now, you know, but how do I know what's useful and what's not? Okay, and what I'm really after here, what I'm trying to measure, is what I call better than the objective model, BTOM or BTOM. You'll see that throughout the rest of the presentation and it's in the paper. You know, I'm looking for proof that subjective judgment adds value. And so what I wanted was 1 statistic. Okay, I'm kind of lazy, to be honest. I wanted 1 statistic that I could just run. I crank, you know, do 1 test and say, yay, verily, either subjective parameters are, you know, add value or they don't. But unfortunately, I never found that killer statistic. Okay, maybe one of you out there is smart enough, you know, but I did some research and I talked to some people, and I never did find one way to prove that a model is, you know, one model is better than another model based on how well it predicted under circumstances like this. But here's some of the statistics I generated, and I generated pretty, you know, the pretty much standard descriptive statistics, such as means, medians, standard deviations, and so forth, just on the estimates themselves, and then of course use things like residuals, calculate residuals, the absolute deviation, the mean, deviation ratio you can see there, other statistics, root mean squared error. Did some statistical tests, both parametric and non-parametric. And then I wanted to look at, you know, I sort of looked at this from 2 dimensions. I looked at this from how individuals did with the 15 mission portfolio versus how the participants did on a specific mission. So you're going to see I looked at that both in both those dimensions, okay, either as an individual or looking at the how the individuals did across a specific mission, and you'll see what that told us or didn't tell us. So as we go through the following charts, here's a little roadmap. All right. So the 10 fully completed surveys I got, I coded those, okay? So these are the 10 completed surveys, AA through AJ, all right? The one partial survey I got back, for that person provided the subjective inputs for one mission, okay? So that's coded BA. The objective model is called, imaginatively enough, OM, all right? And then I also, just for fun, said, well, what if you took a model like Quick Cost, okay, and said, well, I don't feel comfortable using the subjective input, so I'm just going to set them all to the average or median based on the guidance provided. So I also evaluated that model, or those results. Let me say, I evaluated those results running the model with the average and median subjective inputs. So here's the aggregate statistics looking at it for the 15 mission portfolio. So this is looking at how each individual did. And I've color coded this, so if you see green, that's where they did better than the objective model, or if they did red, they did for the worse on the statistical test. And you can see at the bottom, there's the objective model, mean residuals minus 2.2 million, mean absolute deviation under 62 million, and so on and so forth. And then you can see that there was actually one individual who did, you could argue did better, okay? AH, the input AH, did better in most statistics, and just as well, the statistical test, you don't get necessarily any credit for your score, whether it's, as long as it meets the threshold. So it did just as well, passed the test, and did better in 3 of the 4 objective statistics that I used here. So you could argue, hey, there's one individual did better. Another individual did better on 2 of the 4, but the statistics they didn't do very well on. And then the quick cost model with average median inputs actually did about as well too. Okay, it did just as well as, or better, I should say, than the objective model. So found that rather interesting. By the way, I'll talk a little more about AH and who they, I'm not going to name names, but I'm going to talk a little more about that in those inputs a little later. So that just says what I just said. So I also, here's how if you look at it by individual mission, and this is just looking at the residuals for each estimate for this mission. So if you, for example, if you take the very first column there, Cygnus, and look down that, you can see the first person, AA, their residual for their estimate was higher than the objective model estimate, okay? But AB did better, okay? They got closer than the objective model, so so they get a green, okay? So everything where the residual is smaller than the objective model gets a green square. So you can kind of see how that looks, and that actually looks like you see a lot of green squares, right? Or actually, I do in a few minutes tell you how many they are. I did try averaging the results, by the way, taking average of everybody's estimates and seeing how that compares. And overall, out of the 15 mission data set, I got 7 better than objective model estimates, but the overall statistics were not very good. So I don't think there was much value there. That's, by the way, this is kind of a wisdom of crowds test. Okay, so one way to look at this is, okay, who got closer to the target, right? Who did better? And so what I did is I looked at who got closer based on residuals, okay? So you saw the data on the previous slide, and so each individual who provided some inputs, how many out of the inputs they provided did they do better than the objective model? So here you see 3 of them got 8 out of 15 did better than the objective model, okay? So that's better than 50%, okay? Good for them. quick cost model with median average inputs, you can see it did almost 50%. So I gave it a yellow check mark. Okay, it was in the ballpark. And then the rest of these, no, they didn't do better than the objective model. Okay, they did worse. And if you look at it by the mission set, same kind of thing. You know, now we're looking at you know, how the 10 individuals did. So here, if for a specific mission like Cygnus, oh well, you know, 5 people did did better than the objective model. Okay, so that's kind of a coin toss. About half the time they did better than the objective model. About half the time the objective model did better. You can see there are 3 missions here: MSL, which is Mars Science Center, actually 4, excuse me, which was a very complex science mission. It's the Curiosity rover, for those of you who are not NASA insiders. OSIRIS-REx is an asteroid mission, and Van Allen probes and WISE. All of those did better than 50%. Okay, so those, for those 4 missions, the subjective model actually did better based on the survey of the 10, 11 people, and then the rest of them, the objective model did better. I realize it's maybe a little confusing. Hopefully it's explained a little better in the paper. But so if you look at all the responses, okay, so like I said, I got 11 responses. 10 of them provided inputs for all 15 missions. 1 person provided inputs for 1 mission, 151 inputs. Overall, out of all those inputs, 54 of the estimates were better than the objective model. Okay, so that's a win rate of 36%. So while in certain individual cases, like for example, Mars Science Lander or Van Allen probes or OSIRIS-REx, the subjective model did much better, but in the aggregate, the objective model did better. And that's true even when we considered using the subjective quick cost model with the subjective inputs set to average and median. So got a little better, 37 instead of 36%. Well, you know, like I said, I didn't get as many inputs as I wanted, so I thought, well, you know, if we had, you know, a lot of monkeys working on this, there's this thing out there, you can go look at it on Wikipedia. It's called the infinite monkey theorem, okay? And some of you are probably familiar with it. It says, okay, if we had an infinite number of monkeys working for, say, almost an infinite amount of time, would they reproduce things like works of Shakespeare, for example, and all? And actually, the theory, by the way, has been disproven. Just okay, so don't get too excited about it. But it did make me think. Okay, well, what if we just said the inputs were random? Okay, you know, what if instead of point inputs for the subjective parameters, what if we use probability distributions? And so what I did is I set up a Monte Carlo model, and for each subjective variable input, I used PDF, and I used uniform distributions, okay, because I really don't know what the underlying distribution would be of inputs or what it should be. So I said, okay, I'm just going to use a uniform distribution, and I'm going to set the min and max based on the range that Joe defined in the model. I did incorporate correlation. Okay, I said, okay, well, you know, is there any correlation between these inputs? And there was, and you can see that there. So there is some correlation between the subjective inputs. And then I calculated the absolute value of the residual, all right, for each trial, and ran 5,000 trials. And you know, so anyway, so how did the monkeys do? All right. Well, you can see if you look at the top one there, okay, the objective model, as we saw before, its residual was, or the absolute value of the residual, excuse me, was 32.7 million, okay? In other words, it was off by $32.7 million from the actual cost. Well, almost 36% of the time, randomly you would get a better result. Okay, so one way to think about this, these monkeys are generating random results randomly, just by random chance. Okay, you're going to get something better than what the objective model did 36% of the time, if you know nothing else. Okay, if you know nothing else. Now, by the way, people would argue with me, oh, Andy, if we did research and analysis and got real smart, we would do better than 36% piece. Okay, I'm not, that's what the purpose of the survey was to capture that kind of information. So just on pure random chance, okay, you do better. The monkey's going to do better about 36% of the time. And so for 3 of the missions, the monkeys actually did better than the objective model more than 50% of the time. So for like Juno, Laddie, and OSIRIS-REx. Now whether, and if you look at each one of those, you can see that these were cases where the objective model didn't do very well. Okay, especially for Juno, you can see very high residual there. OSIRIS-REx, very high residual. Though in other cases like MSL, was a very high residual. The monkeys didn't do better. They only did better about 43% of the time. Actual individuals, by the way, did better there. So the average of all of this was 33%. Okay, so monkeys didn't really do better. So here's Scorecard. Okay, so if you look at the participants, okay, we had 11 participants. 1 did better, 9 did worse, and I called 1 a tie. Okay, well, clearly the objective model did better there. If you look at just on the aggregate how the participants did, well, they only did better 36% of the time, which meant the objective model did better 64% of the time. Okay, so you're better off using the objective model. When you compare it though to using the quick cost model with just the median or average inputs, it's kind of a tie. Okay, kind of which I think kind of validates my argument here that the subjective inputs just add more. You could say add more error. Okay, because just by picking the average, you actually did better. Monkeys didn't do very well, as we just saw. So in my opinion, the objective model is clear winner over the survey participants and the monkeys. And as I just said, quick cost with average median settings, I think did about as well as the objective model. So I'll talk a little bit about what the lesson learned there is. But given these results, are there still situations where people believe we should use subjective input variables? All right, so I give a little airtime here to my friend Christian Smart. He provided this input as we were having a discussion about this issue last year, and he admits there could be hazards. Okay, I'm not going to read through this. You can read it, these are certainly very thoughtful inputs, and he certainly agrees there are hazards. They can be manipulated, are prone to biases. However, he really likes percent new design. He thinks it's an important cost driver, and he points out some of the things mentioned earlier. Okay. He says, hey, there's always going to be subjectivity in our estimates and models. Well, I have to admit there's some truth to that. And he argues for experience, knowledge and experience, and there's actually some value to that I'm going to talk about here in just a minute. And he also points out we have small data sets in the NASA space business, and that is certainly true. Okay. One of the things we're wrestling with right now is a new human lunar lander for the moon. Okay, a new human lunar lander. Well, as we're trying to estimate that, there's only one historical data point to compare that to. Okay, and it was built back in the 1960s. It's called the Apollo lunar module, and so that's just something I know other parts of the cost community struggle with that as well, in DoD and elsewhere, but it's certainly a problem, a significant problem in the space community, especially in human space flight. And so sometimes you have to use judgment. You don't have a choice there. So I want to share this because I thought it was fair to give airtime to the other point of view here. So here's my guidance. Here's my recommended guidance for all of us, especially in the space community going forward. I would say when in doubt, which is probably about 90% of the time, you shouldn't use subjective parameters, okay? And I think there's still a high potential for abuse. I think you can add value if the estimator has in-depth knowledge of the system and significant estimating experience. Remember before, there was one input, AH, which did better than the objective model overall. Well, it turns out AH is not an individual. It's a composite input. I had sent the survey to someone at NASA headquarters, and that individual, and I'd ask them to send it, oh, you know these other cost estimators in the agency, would you send it to them? Well, what he did is he surveyed each one of those individuals, and by the way, let me back up a little bit. These individuals had worked on review teams for these different missions. So he actually sent the survey to individuals who had worked on those specific review teams. So in other words, he would send the survey to the person who worked Cygnus review team, hey, give me the inputs for Cygnus. And the person who worked for Mars Science Lander would say, hey, give me your inputs for Mars Science Lander. Well, these people had in-depth knowledge of the system, as well as being very experienced cost estimators. And they were able to do better than the objective model. So that's something to keep in mind here. However, most people tend to overestimate their knowledge and experience. And when you're presented with a system that you don't have a lot of in-depth knowledge and experience about, or that is still very early in the design process and there's not a lot of in-depth knowledge and experience, it's very easy, I think, to overestimate your own abilities there. I would not overtly introduce subjectivity into an estimate unless you can have credible, supportable, and defendable logic and justification for that subjectivity. You need to recognize, hey, I could be wrong here. I could be adding error. Your subjectivity, by the way, and I've seen this happen, I've had it happen to me, can be used against you by people who have in-depth technical knowledge and in-depth programmatic knowledge. And wherever possible, you should calibrate and validate against historical experience, because that can keep you from wandering off the reservation, so to speak, wandering off the farm, and going someplace where it's you now have an estimate that may not be defendable. They can, I think, be useful. These subjective inputs can be useful when you're trying to estimate systems outside the model's experience base. I think a good example of that was Mars Science Lander, which was much more complex than anything in the 131 mission database that Joe Hamaker and I used to develop the models. And in that particular instance, or for that particular mission, every 7 out of the 10, I believe, estimators did better. Okay, same thing was true of OSIRIS-REx. And finally, I've seen subjective assessments used when you're doing a comparative analysis. In other words, like an analysis of alternatives, or looking at several systems, comparing several systems. As long as you follow a systematic application and approach, I think, to how you're using the subjective inputs, I think that could be valuable. Okay. Maybe not in an absolute sense, but certainly in a comparative sense. So finally, it looks like I'm gonna wrap up here about right on time. Yeah, subjective parameters do make our job easier. They don't automatically make our estimates better, in my opinion. The less information you have, I said this before, the less information you have, the more you should rely on objective models. Be very careful with subjective inputs when you're in a low information situation. Don't always assume you're an expert. I like to believe I'm an expert. Okay, I've got the credentials, I can wave around, but I'm sometimes not as smart as I like to think I am. And I'm certainly not unbiased. I tell you, I did learn from this that doing a survey is a whole lot harder than it looks. If I do another survey, I'm going to certainly make it shorter and simpler. And so my advice to all of you out there is that if you're going to use subjective parameters, use them with caution. And that is my presentation. And so, Megan, do we have any questions?
We did get one from Doug Howarth. I'm going to unmute you, Doug. Please, oh, you are unmuted. Good job. Doug.
Hey, Andy.
Hey, Doug.
How are you?
I'm doing all right. How are you doing?
Good, thanks. I believe you answered it, but I hadn't seen 130% of new being used before. When we were at Lockheed, we would separate percent new when we were using subjective inputs, percent new from state of the art, and it looks like you kind of jammed them both together. Can you explain the procedures you have there at NASA to get to a 130% of new?
Well, like I said, I didn't develop the model. Joe did, but I'll try and speak for him. I think what he was doing was combining both the level of new design and the state of the art.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so if you went over 100%, not only was it a brand new design, but you're now introducing new technology.
Oh, okay. So you just simply jam those two things together, those two attributes together then.
I think that's how Joe did it. I took the subjective model is the analysis Joe did. I did not create that model. Joe Hamaker created that model.
Sure. Okay. Thank you for that. I appreciate it.
Oh, you're welcome.
All right. Up next with a question, we have Christian Smart.
Hey, Christian.
Go ahead and unmute yourself, Christian. There you go.
Okay, can you hear me? Hey, Andy.
Yes.
Hey, Christian.
Hey, thanks for the great presentation. One question that I have for you is, one of the potential abuses with something like percent new design, like you talked about, is the ability to dial the estimate down. Project managers are prone to optimism. But speaking of which, did you notice in the survey results any bias? So when they use a subjective model, was there any bias to the low end or the high end with the estimates? Did you see any pattern like that?
Yes. Actually, most people tended to overestimate. In fact, I was going to, I did some, let me see, there's actually a backup chart here that shows that. I picked on one respondent, AB, and you can see the residuals, range of the residuals on the left are from the objective model, okay, and how they're distributed. And then if you look on the right, that's the distribution for respondent AB. It was pretty typical. Most of the missions were overestimated. So in fact, and I'll say this in favor of my respondents, okay, most of them were conservative.
So no project managers in the respondees then, I guess.
No, I didn't send it to any project managers.
Okay, they could have balanced out the cost estimators maybe.
So perhaps, you got a good point here that most of us who've been doing this for a while or would tend to maybe be very conservative, knowing that when you go sit down with a project manager or present to the project team, they're gonna kind of push back and want you to be more optimistic.
Okay, yeah. Okay, thanks, Andy. Great presentation.
Thank you. Thanks, Christian.
Thanks, Christian. And Hank. We have another question Hank Apgar has his hand raised. I'm going to just unmute you. Hank, you can unmute yourself if you want to ask a question.
Hey, Hank.
Hello, Andy.
Hey, Hank.
I enjoyed your presentation. I don't have a question with your conclusions, but I would like to make a comment that maybe skews the opinion a little bit. Many people look down on subjective models because they're subjective. I would take the opposite approach. I'm skeptical of many objective models because when we use them, we disregard the fact that the data most often was collected by a third party, by other people at different times, and the data was normalized and homogenized, and became the basis of developing CERs. However, we can't always trust the sanctity of the CER. I've been on both ends of the equation. I've worked for companies that use their own data to build their own models. And I know the standard questions have been, hey, Joe, what does this mean? I don't know, Chuck. Let's just assume that these are labor hours direct or whatever. And so we cover over the fact that many equations are subjective to begin with. So that's my 2 cents. Enjoyed your presentation. Thanks a lot.
Oh, thank you, Hank. You know, you raise a very good observation and make a point that others have made to me. And I have worked on both sides as well. In fact, my first job out of college was analyzing raw data and using it, then the analyzed data, to build cost estimating relationships. And you are exactly right. Sometimes that data is requires a lot of TLC to get it into a form where you feel like you can use it in a model. And that is true even now at NASA, even though we have the cadre that we use, I mentioned earlier, which are a significant improvement over what we had prior to that, where data was just kind of collected in a very haphazard manner. We're still seeing that the quality of the data can be significant between from project to project. So you're right, there's a lot of subjectivity in the data analysis. There's subjectivity that goes into the model development. And yes, as Christian also pointed out in the comments that I shared, you know, we're not at a place where that is, we can say that doesn't exist. And so, you know, I guess out of a result of this, just I'm not as hard over as I used to be about the use of subjective inputs and parameters. That's why my final advice is just use them with caution. Just be careful, recognize what you're doing, and the fact you may be introducing bias or error. But if you have a lot of knowledge about the system you're estimating and about the model, and a lot of just knowledge in general about, say, in our case, the space business, or maybe for others it would be maybe if you're estimating aircraft or whatever. If you have a lot of knowledge in general about those systems, then okay, I'm not going to say it's a bad thing to do. Okay, I'm not going to tell people that they shouldn't do it. Just be careful.
Oh, we've got another question coming in. You're getting everybody's gears turning. Sarah, are you ready to speak? We're ready for you when you are.
Yes, thank you for taking this time. I really enjoyed kind of seeing how you can have those parameters. And I know myself, I have seen some of those parametrics where I wondered kind of more about what's behind the door. And speaking of overestimating, was there a particular phase in these missions? Did you actually be able to capture where the actuals were much lower in one section more than the other?
When you say phase, can you help me understand a little more about what you mean by that?
Well, when I worked with NASA with the missions, as per se, you had it wasn't directly like launch or shut, like for example, there was a time where things were getting built up and then it was, that's what I mean by phase. Was there a particular time, the beginning or actually completion?
Okay, so you're thinking more about the milestones that NASA has in its development process, and is that what you're getting at?
Yes.
Like, PDR, CDR, so forth?
Yes.
Okay. No, I did not look at I didn't do that. I worked with only the as completed cost. And that's why the missions I chose had to have been developed and launched, because there's a cadre that's created
Yes.
right before launch called the launch cadre, and I wanted to only use those.
Okay. Yeah, I was just curious because I remember from seeing things from the Air Force, the Army side, and then kind of going over to NASA, it was interesting to see how it was actually fairly common, the bias to actually be towards the beginning instead of being more sustaining part and after launch, just, you know, and stuff like that. It seemed to be very common that it was in the beginning. I was just curious if you happen to see that.
Okay, yeah, that would be interesting to explore, but I didn't explore that.
I appreciate it. Thank you.
And I believe that is the last one we got. And at 12:55, well timed, everybody.
Well,
Thank you, Andy. Do you have your slide? Do you have a slide with your contact info? There we go.
yeah, and I picked a little cowboy icon because we were going to be in San Antonio, right? But unfortunately, we were not. So next year, hopefully we'll all be together.
Yes, here's to hoping. If you want to speak at next year's workshop, we are already collecting abstracts. You can find that. There's a link on the front of the ICEAonline.com webpage. It's also available at ICEAonline.com/CFP21, but it's easier to just push the picture. Thank you for everyone for coming today. Thank you, Andy, for giving us this presentation. I hope to hear more of you folks next week, or with Doug Howarth, who we got a question from earlier today. He's going to present a 3-market 10-dimension trade. So mark your calendars for that one. And unless you have anything else to add, Andy?
Thank y'all. Thank y'all for giving me this opportunity.
Right on. And thank you, everyone. We're going to call it a wrap. Be good, be safe, be sane. Thank you so much, and have a great rest of your day.